Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast brought to you by Renthal Street Fly Racing and KTM. Check out renthal.com and the Fit My Bike option to see all the parts you can fit to your motorbike. On today's podcast, we've got our traditional post-round patrons Q&A. So on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast, you can sign up to become a patron and ask us anything after a Grand Prix weekend. We've got quite a few random questions in. Dave, just before we kind of get into all the meat of today's pod, we've actually got a new interview on Patreon as well. So a Jack Miller interview about ride height devices. So that's probably going to drop around the same time that we put this podcast out to Patreon. But a really interesting chat. And Jack was very insightful about the history of the ride height device.
Yeah, exactly, because he was the first person to do it. He was the first person to actually use one in a race. So, yeah, it was fascinating. And he explains also, the sort of like the nuts and bolts of it, what it actually does to the bike, how it changes the bike, how it feels, how it changes riding, that sort of thing. So yeah, it was just I wanted to ask him about it precisely because he's been on the bike. He's been racing these things since they were invented, and he was through those early iterations of the of ride height devices and whole shot devices from Ducati. So, I was quite pleased with how it turned out.
Yeah, I have to say it's definitely well worth listening. So check that out on Patreon. We're going to get straight into it for our Thai Grand Prix roundup. And on Patreon each week we ask who was your rider of the weekend. And Pecco Bagnaia won this pretty resoundingly with a 52% vote. And Neil, one of the other things we asked was, what did everyone think of Pecco in Thailand? And where this win ranks up. Just before we do, for you, Neil, where does the win rack up for Pecco?
I think it's among his more impressive ones, certainly this year. You would certainly look at how he's delivered in some of his big championship showdown races in the last 2 years as maybe his finest ones. Plus that first win against Marquez as well, I think ranks right up there. But yeah, I think considering just how low the mood was on Saturday and how almost everyone in the paddock was starting to say that, the championship is Jorge's now. I think it was pretty remarkable that he still managed to turn it around. Maybe got a little bit lucky with the conditions, but he still fought off Marquez and managed to keep his head in what were really sketchy conditions.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting on Sunday's pod whenever yourselves and Adam were chatting about just dealing with that pressure. And David, that was one of the things that TV Room Raccoon was interested to comment on, the fact that Pecco just looked so in control all the way through this race, whereas for Jorge Martin, he always looked on the verge of a crash. Now, he didn't crash, but he was always right on that limit.
Yeah, I mean, I got the impression, sort of watching them, listening to the press conference, that they'd both made a small change in warm up, or perhaps Martin hadn't made a change, but certainly after warm up, Pecco's team made a change, and that gave him an enormous amount of confidence. And the conditions changed sufficiently between warm up and the race that the confidence that Martin had in the morning was gone a little bit. So he was really on the edge. He said he crashed nearly 15 times or so. He lost that control, and especially I think once he, but the two moments, first of all, running wide at turn 3 on the opening lap, and then watching Mark crash out in front of him and almost watching. I watched the onboard for Martin's. For that moment behind Mark, and you can actually sort of see him because the camera is looking at Martin, and you can see the forks go backwards and forwards quite violently. So really, he was very, very close to a crash. And I think from then he realised, okay, no, just take the points, But yeah, Pecco gained so much confidence from the change in the morning warm up that was really the difference for him.
Yeah, I thought that one of the interesting comments we had was from Adam and from Patrick as well. And Patrick was saying that Pecco is the best rider under that extreme pressure. And Adam just talking about that Iceman nature for Pecco. And whenever he has it, he's unbelievable, but he doesn't do it consistently enough. And I think that's a fair comment to make, Neil, considering all the mistakes we've seen from both our championship contenders this season.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think when the pressure's really on, though, Pecco has proved that he's probably the coolest of the lot. And yeah, I guess he'll have to deliver again in the next 2 weekends that are coming up. So, yeah, it was interesting even just to watch them both in the press conference afterwards. I think there was a kind of contrast between the pair. Jorge was jittery and couldn't sit still. You could tell he was still buzzing off the adrenaline that he had been feeding off during the race, and was talking at a million miles an hour. And Pecco was just sat there completely tranquil and chill, really, considering what had just gone before. And I think that that sort of is a nice little snapshot into the differences in the pair, and maybe a little bit to the kind of approaches of them as well.
I've got a question for the both of you. Take a guess at how much Pecco Bagnaia has closed the gap on Jorge Martin in the last 6 races.
3
I'd
points.
say about 8 points.
6.
6.
Yeah, so basically he's averaging 1 point a race, and there's 1 point a weekend, sorry, and there's 2 weekends left, which is not really going to be enough.
Yeah, it's one of those ones, Dave, where as the season wears on, your percentage points, you always talk about how many points are available after each weekend. There's still a long season. There's still this many points left. But the fact that you're getting towards the end of those seasons, even with Pecco gaining a few points on Martin's still in a stronger position than he was going into Thailand. And that's always the big challenge. And that kind of leads us into one of the questions or one of the comments we had from VJ as well, that the title fight truly is on now in VJ's eyes, just because Sepang and Valencia haven't traditionally been Jorge Martin's strongest circuits. And, you know, for VJ, this is the moment for Pecco to pounce, but there's so many points for him to make up.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. It's really difficult to make up that many points. He needs to make up, he needs to make up at least 17 points in 2 rounds. And the trouble is that all Martin needs to do is finish behind him. And I just checked the results from last year, and that was exactly what happened. What happened last year? You know, Martin just basically sat behind him. This is, and it's very different when you have a lead. It's very different when you actually have the advantage. It means there's a lot less. There's a lot less to do. There's a lot less variables. You have a lot more under control. So, yeah, I think that Jorge Martin is in the driving seat, and as I said, like 74 points left, 2 rounds, but 17 points to make up, and that's a lot.
Yeah, let's move on to some of our questions. So as I said, patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. Sign up as a Paddock Insider and you get all of our Paddock Note shows during the course of each weekend. You also get interviews like the Jack Miller Ride-Height interview and plenty of others through the course of the year. And you get the opportunity to ask us questions. So the big talking point, the big topic for this week is obviously the championship battle. And Neil, we had a question in from Lynn Biggs, and Lynn was asking that Pecco needs help to win the championship, basically, and who's going to be able to give it to
him? It's an interesting question. I mean, you would look at his teammate as the obvious choice in Bastianini, but Bastianini has kind of got his own things on the table. He wants to beat Marquez in the fight for 3rd overall, and that I think is his priority. Also, Pecco has been pretty adamant that he isn't seeking help. That might be tested in the weeks to come. But I think Pecco, if I'm not mistaken, said over the weekend that he doesn't expect any help and he's not the kind of rider that will ask for help. So it will be interesting to see if that changes. I think it's an admirable point of view. Also, in Bastianini, one of his best tracks is Sepang, won there last year, obviously, in an otherwise pretty bad season, and hounded Pecco for victory there in 2022. So there was a reason to believe that Bastianini could be a favourite for victory here this weekend in Sepang. But yeah, if anyone is going to do it, it's going to be Iannone. But it seems as though Pecco is not really that keen on seeking that help at the moment.
It's a difficult situation as well, anyway, because for a start, no one's going to help anyone at Sepang because it's just Sepang. There's still a race there. If Ducati were to start asking for assistance, it won't be until Valencia because so much can still happen. But if you think about it, Pecco is there in the factory Ducati team. His teammate is leaving. So there's no incentive for Anea to help Pecco at Valencia. Jorge Martin is leaving, but Franco Morbidelli is staying. I mean, he's moving to the VR46 team, but he's staying with Ducati. So his incentive is to help Pecco. They're also part of they're both part of the VR46 Academy as well. It becomes quite complicated. But in reality, I don't think it's going to make enough difference. I don't think it's going to be. If they get to Valencia and there's 2 or 3 points in it, then it becomes a different calculation. But I can't see that happening. I think there's still going to be a double-digit gap, and at that point, it's just down to Pecco to do what he can, and for Martin to just follow Pecco around.
Also, there is only a very select few that could realistically help Pecco, because as we've seen in the second half of the year, Pecco and Martin have been consistently up at the front, and only Anea, Mark, and occasionally Pedro have been able to run with them. So you say Franco Morbidelli there, Dave, but when is Franco going to be in a situation where he's possibly able to influence the result at the front? So, I think the options are very, very limited.
Yeah, I think when you look at it, especially for Franco, he's turned the season around and it's for top 6s, top 7s. So not really in a position to be able to offer too much help at this stage. But one of the other questions we had in as well, Dave, was from Simon, and he was asking whether or not this was a great win for Pecco, but was it too little too late for that championship? I know we've already kind of touched on that at this point, but what do you think of Pecco's chances then for Simon?
I mean, Pecco has already won 9 races this season. If my maths, well, I mean, like I did a quick scan through the history book last night, and I think if he doesn't win the championship, he's going to be the rider with the most wins in one season who didn't win the championship. Jorge Lorenzo won 8 in 2013. He already has 9 wins. His problem is not being able to win. He can win. He proved that he can win. Pecco's problem is that he keeps falling, or especially in the first half of the season, he kept falling off. There's been 2 occasions where the DNFs weren't his fault, at Le Mans and at, you can argue the toss at Aragon. He had an involvement, but also Alex Marquez had a very big role to play. Oh yeah, Portimao, that was his fault. That was Portimao was all Pecco. That was Pecco trying to.
I loved it in Portimao though. That was the
fun.
one where he had to do that, though. He had to show that he was going to fight for what he could gain, and
yeah,
that's
it's going to cost it. It could end up costing him the championship.
Yeah, he gained respect, Dave.
Yeah, but not the respect that naturally comes with the number 1 plate. So I think those are that's been his weakness. His weakness is that he crashes. If you look at I think Jorge has 3 DNFs. And it's basically like 7-3 in terms of DNFs, and that is your difference.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the season, Pecco's outscored Martin at 10 rounds this year, and still trails him in the championship, and that inconsistency is the big thing. We had obviously VJ's question about going down to the wire in Valencia, just because Sepang isn't one of Martin's best tracks. I don't think he's had a podium there in MotoGP. I think he's had a top 5 finish, and that was it. So a good point from VJ about that. But Yanni has also asked about it going down to the wire, and I have to say, Yanni, if this is the question you want to ask, we're going to ask serious questions about you as well. If the MotoGP title fight does go to Valencia, will David be there on his knees and slither his sensitive tongue across the asphalt, groan softly and tell everyone that the Michelin tyre selection isn't what you want for this conditions, and then give everyone a recommendation on the tyre? Yanni does say that he's asking this for a friend, but I'm not buying that, Dave.
Yeah, no, I'm not buying it either. No, I mean, it is actually quite a good question. I mean, we know that the track was recently resurfaced. It's a known quantity. The much bigger factor at Valencia is the temperature, and especially in those few right-handers, like turn 4. Turn 4 is one which always catches people out, and it's going to be really, really easy to make a mistake. So I mean, like I am definitely going to be watching the tyre selection, but it's going to be really tricky because of the temperature. It's middle of November. It might be 18 or 19 degrees, but it might be 11 or 12 degrees.
I have to say one thing, just as you say about I'll be looking at the tyres. One of the guys in Dorna did this for me a few years ago. He put together a little montage of all my key moments through the season for the videos. And it was literally just, I've just had the tyre sheet from Pirelli. Everyone's out there on the hard front tyre and the X-rear tyre. So I'll be keeping an eye on the tyre sheet as well, Dave. But we'll move on to one of our other big talking points from listeners on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. And it's Marc Marquez. So, Dave, you've already touched on the Bastianini dynamic up against Marc. So, Neil, I want to get your opinion on it as well, because third in the World Championship, it means more probably to Iannone than it does to Marc. But Marc clearly wants to just go out there and win a lot of races between now and the end of the season. Obviously, we saw the crash at the weekend. We've seen him on that limit. But where do you see that battle for third going?
It's tough, really, because Sepang is Annea's track, and then Valencia is Marc's track. So feasibly, you could see both of them getting further wins before the season is out. Marc was asked about this in Thailand, and he said he would rather win more races than finish third overall. So I think he's going to be all in when the opportunity presents itself, without really considering the need to collect points. Annea, I don't think really has a great record at Valencia. So feasibly, I think Marc is currently sat ahead of Annea by, he scans the sheet, 11 points. So yeah, I think he could probably hold that on until the end of the season.
Yeah, it was interesting actually that we had some questions in about Marc's penalty during the course of the race, and Rick was one of the patrons asking us about the fact that Marc received a penalty for losing drop one position for his move on Joan Mir, and he ignored it. If he had taken it at the time, he would have had to wait 4 seconds and then change positions, and instead he carried on, passed more riders, gained a bigger gap, and then gave off the position at the end. And as it was for Rick and for quite a few other patrons, it seemed a little bit unfair. And obviously enough, it ends up helping Marc a little bit in his battle for third against Bastianini. He picks up an extra couple of points that he wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't exactly ignore it, because he did actually drop a position when he passed. I think he passed Taka and then dropped back behind him. So yeah, his race would have been run if he had to slow down and go back behind Mir. But I think he said that as soon as the contact was made, he was like, I know I'm going to have to drop a position. So he knew basically what he was doing, but I think he he maximized the situation for his own end, which you have to say, that's it's the end of the game, really, at the end of the day. And also he was
very out of character for Marc as well to do that, isn't it?
It's very surprising to hear him say this. He was also saying that, I think we mentioned this in Sunday's show, but from the TV, it looked like he was a bit wild and a bit out of control with Mir. But he did say that they were pretty much neck and neck when they got to the braking area. And he thought, there's not really any reason for Mir to tough this out. Plus, he had no rear brake, so he wasn't able to stop exactly how I wanted. But yeah, I wouldn't say he ignored it. He just sort of maximized the situation to his own end.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly smart. Also, because he sees Taka, knows that he can pass Taka, passes Taka, drops back, and then passes him again. It's absolutely not in the spirit of the rules, but within the letter of the rules, so it's allowed. But I did, because I was curious about it, and also I wanted to go because also Marc's suit opened a little bit in the crash. So I was watching the onboards to see what had happened. And him talking about being next to Joan Mir, I was watching the onboard from Marc, and the camera again is facing Marc, but at no point does Joan Mir even come into view. So I'm not completely convinced of his explanation that he was sort of level with Joan Mir. Mir was absolutely furious. He said he should have got a long lap penalty. Well, he was furious, but he was determined not to comment about it. Just saying, he dropped one position, but that doesn't help me, does it? If he'd have gotten a long lap penalty, then it would have been, in his view, it would have been fairer. And I think he's got a point.
Yeah, we had it in Supersport at Areth. I can't remember which rider it was, but basically ended another rider's race. It was Tan on Chu, I think. And Onchu ended up getting a long lap penalty, came back into the pits, put on fresh tyres as well, and then puts it on the front row of the grid with the rules that we have for fastest lap setting grid position. So he ended up actually getting the benefit from being given the penalty, and the other rider ends up qualifying at the back field. It could have been Jorge Navarro, and Navarro then had to try and come through the field. So it was, it's one of those ones where the penalty, it never seems to fit the punishment that the other rider gets. And it's just the way it goes with it. But we're going to move on to chat a little bit about KTM as well. And Neil, we had a question in from Calopedia. And Cal was asking whether or not KTM has a technical advantage in the wet conditions because their riders are always fast in it, or does it just come down to their riders having wet weather ability and a willingness to take on greater risks?
I think it's a mix of both. I think it was 2 years ago when Miguel Oliveira won 2 races in the rain in Indonesia and in Thailand that you could say that the KTM definitely had a bit of a wet weather advantage, but you just have to look at the results on Sunday. I don't think that you would say the KTM is a better bike in the rain than the Ducati. I guess to really test that, Jack Miller would have had to have started on the front row and gone head to head with Jorge Martin and Pecco from the start, basically. But it does seem that the KTMs, there were 3 of them basically there fighting for the podium, 3 of them in the top 6, one of their best days of the season. But yeah, I think it's a combination of the bike working pretty well, and also they've got Miller and Acosta, who just happens to be ludicrously quick at being able to pick up and learn in new situations.
Yeah, I don't think that it's that KTM have an advantage in the wet. It's just that the bikes matter less in the wet. I mean, we still had an all Ducati podium. We had 2 Ducatis on the podium. Would have been 3 Ducatis if Mark hadn't fallen off. The Ducatis were all pretty much up the front, so the Ducati is good in the wet. The KTM's had a bit of a disadvantage because they were spinning the rear and chewing up the centre of the tyre quite a lot. Now they were doing that in the dry as well, so that looks like either a weight distribution problem or an electronics problem. But I think it's more just you see it in the wet. It levels the playing field in terms of bike and equipment. They're going 10 or 11 seconds a lap slower, so you're not extracting the maximum performance out of the bike anymore. It comes much more down to the ability of a rider to judge grip and to manage risk.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I thought at one stage during the race that Martin was going to get caught by the KTMs just because of having the strong riders that they have. So it is always impressive whenever you see KTM like that in the wet conditions. And we've actually got a few questions that came in as well about KTM and Moto2 and Moto3. And Dave, now that you're obviously our MotoGP, Moto3 expert, I'll come to you first about it as well. And it's about David Alonso and how KTM can kind of fit him into their plans going forward, because if Alonso comes out next year and has another very impressive Moto2 season to back up what he's done in Moto3 this year, is there any pressure on KTM to make sure that they've got a MotoGP winning bike so that they're able to keep Acosta and David Alonso on their bikes going forward?
I mean, yeah, there is pressure on KTM anyway. I mean, I visited KTM earlier this year and had a very, briefly ran into Pit Beyer and Stefan Pierer at lunch. And Pit Beyer, I was sort of like saying, you're doing pretty well with Pedro Acosta, and he was saying, no, we're really disappointed because of where they are in terms of the bike. The bike, KTM think the bike isn't good enough, so they already have a massive amount of incentive. They will have to do something to keep Acosta because Acosta signed up through 25 and 26. But if he is on a bike that he doesn't feel he can win a championship on, I think he will have no qualms about going somewhere else. He's incredibly ambitious, which is why he fell off so many times this year. And Alonso, first of all, I want to see what Alonso does in Moto2. But yeah, I think Alonso. I mean, I fully expect Alonso to be in MotoGP in 2027. The question is on what bike, whether it's going to be in Tech 3, whether it's going to be maybe replacing Brad Binder if Brad gets fed up or something. I mean, 2027 is going to be a complete lottery anyway, but they're really going to have to do their best to keep Alonso.
Yeah, I think I'm excited to see what Alonso can do on it, but it's always that transition from Moto3 to Moto2 is never easy because
Yeah.
for someone like Alonso, I seem to remember it being like 2020 whenever he made his CEV debut in Moto3. So it's a long time to spend time on a Moto3 bike and then make the adjustment. Not everyone can do it. We've seen that time and again. So it'll be interesting to see what happens for him. But Neil, one rider that could make the adjustment from Moto3 to Moto2 was Iagura. And we had a question in from Ricardo. Just more of a statement. Just a big shout out to Iagura because how cool is he? And it was a great performance at the weekend from Iagura and a great achievement to be able to win the World Championship. But you've got a lot of additional content for us that's Iagura related that we're going to be putting on Patreon pretty soon.
Yes, I have an interview with his crew chief, Norman Rank, which we did on the Saturday just before everyone went off on their separate ways. He was pretty confident at that stage that I was going to get the job done. And anyone that has keenly followed Moto2 coverage and heard Norman interviewed knows that he's a pretty colorful character is the way I would put it. So yeah, it was. I was listening back to it yesterday, typing some of it up, and it was actually making me laugh quite a lot. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled to our Patreon, Paddock Pass. Well, no, patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. That'll be up maybe in the next week or two.
Is it possible for us to put more reason for people to sign up for Patreon? Well, we're gonna go some over the course of the winter to make sure that there's plenty all the way through for everyone once the MotoGP season finishes up. We had a question in from Rudenvort as well, and Rudenvort was asking just what was Fermin Aldeguer thinking. So Neil, again, you're our Moto2 man. So Aldeguer's crash, it was obviously in the changeable conditions. It's always a bit tricky, but Fermin ended up big penalty for him with the crash and obviously the injury as well.
Yeah, it looks as though he has broken something in his hand. Not exactly sure, but I think he's returned back to Europe, to Barcelona, to have surgery just before Sepang, so he won't be in Malaysia this weekend. I mean, first glance, it looked idiotic what happened because he was down in 9th and Tony Arbolino was in 5th, and he went to pass, or he went to Tony's inside and obviously cleaned him out and cleaned himself out. But I'm going to reserve any super harsh judgment because a penalty hasn't been delivered yet, and race direction, the stewards, they wanted to basically go over some of the technical data to understand exactly what was going on before coming to a decision. So maybe there was something wrong with the bike, maybe something wrong with his brakes. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, I'll reserve judgment before we hear exactly what happened.
Dave, one of the questions that I actually had to me on Twitter was about the Iagura signing for Trackhouse for next year and comparing that to Fermin Aldeguer. And Ducati obviously have been under increased pressure for the fact that Aldeguer's performances haven't lived up to the billing this year, whereas when Agura signed for Trackhouse, his performances have improved since that time, and now he's obviously been crowned the champion. Just when you look at those contracts, it's basically you're buying stock and you're trying to buy low and sell high, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We won't know if it's worked for either of those riders until they actually sit on a MotoGP bike, but it is always interesting to see just the discussions for it. And what I find interesting especially is that you did a nice interview with Lynn Jarvis that, again, another bit of our Patreon content for over the winter, but the comparison is pretty clear as well between when Yamaha signed Jorge Lorenzo, a guy that hadn't won a world championship, everyone knew was talented, but they signed him 18 months in advance and it all worked out well for them. And it can work out like that.
Yeah, yes, exactly. For riders who are obviously extremely talented. I think, I mean, if there's a criticism of Ducati for signing Aldeguer so early, it's that they signed him before he'd actually had a chance to race the Pirellis, because I think that did significantly change the way that the championship works, and I think it honestly has been one of the most interesting developments this year, the way that the Pirellis have changed Moto3 and they've changed Moto2. So I think, yes, you could definitely accuse Ducati of jumping the gun there. I mean, Iagura has just been really solid, you know, like he is going to be champion with, I think, 3 wins. Is that correct, Neil? You know, he yeah, exactly. So he's in the same way that Jorge Martin also leading the championship on 3 wins. You win your championships on the bad days, and I think that is actually really good. A good portent for Aprilia, because it means that Agura is going to come in and he's going to work and he's going to be solid and he's going to, he's going to figure things out. And I think that can sometimes be more valuable than a mercurial talent. I mean, the Trackhouse have already got a mercurial talent in young Raul Fernandez, and occasionally he shows flashes of brilliance, and then for the rest of the time he just disappears. So. Again, I think it's actually quite a canny signing by Aprilia. I'm quite interested to see what I is going to be able to do, because I think he's got the right attitude.
Yeah, I do think as well, like for Aldeguer, obviously the injury now changes everything, but he's only 4 points off third in the championship. I think he's actually, it hasn't been that bad a year. It's been just much more up and down, but that's always what it was going to be like with everyone changing to the Pirellis. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the season finishes off now, because Sergio Garcia, obviously just a miserable second half of the season, still third in the championship. But Manuel Gonzalez, Alonso Lopez, they're all pretty close to him, so they could all finish third in the championship. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And just one last question in as well. It came in from Adam Cole, so whichever you want to take this. But watching the broadcast over the course of the weekend, he heard that Thailand will be the season opener next year. Obviously, this was confirmed a couple of weeks ago. But what happened to Qatar always being guaranteed the season opener? And, I always thought this was set in stone, said Adam. Is it therefore possible that the FIM and Dorna can find a way to put Phillip Island at round 1?
There is no way that Phillip Island can be made round 1 until the Melbourne F1 is moved to a different date. The reason that Phillip Island is where it is, I mean, we went over this.
They love it for Superbikes, Dave.
It's because they love it for Superbikes. No, but I mean, just imagine you could have the Superbike test 1 week, Superbike test, Superbike race, and then MotoGP. I mean, how class would that be?
I'll be honest. All I want to see is a MotoGP Superbike double bill. And we only bring the top class to them. So it's kind of like what Laguna used to be for MotoGP with Moto America or AMA supporting as it was at the time. And you end up with just the double bill of here's the best bikes in the world, let's go. And I think that would be such a cool event, especially considering that you've got one race on the Saturday, one on the Sunday for MotoGP. You've got one on the Saturday and 2 on the Sunday for Superbikes. So fans would still get a really good weekend. I think it would be just really cool to be able to put something like that on and give everyone something a little bit different. So I'm holding out hope that that's how we end up with Phillip Island at round 1. So I still keep Phillip Island as my round 1, and everyone's happy then. So it's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of Qatar, why Qatar isn't the opening, I think it's because Ramadan falls in that period. They couldn't move it around, and it would have been extremely difficult for all the corner workers to, be fasting through so much of the day, working out in the heat. It becomes extremely dangerous. And so they've missed it this year. I suspect they'll be back as the first year, as the first race next year.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. But let's move it on to Sepang this weekend. And Neil, there was obviously a bit of news that Andrea Iannone will be making his comeback to MotoGP this week.
Yeah, exactly. Crazy to think that Iannone will be back at the scene of where basically he failed a drug test, which eventually led to his 4-year ban from competition. Yeah, it seems that Iannone's played his cards right in that he's always kept himself fairly close to the VR46 group, and he's been good friends with Uccio and Valentino, and I think it was Valentino that personally wanted him to take up the place to substitute Fabio Di Giannantonio this weekend. So yeah, it's a cool thing. It's great to see Iannone offered this little redemption arc. He's obviously had a pretty solid season in Superbike, you would say. Finishing 8th in the championship, getting 1 victory, and we know how talented he is, how good he is at adapting. I mean, it's going to be interesting to hear his opinions on just how much MotoGP has changed since he was last racing in 2019. But yeah, I mean, personally, I'm just quite excited to see him and be able to speak to him in his media debriefs, because I've heard from several people that he's a bit of a changed man.
Yeah, it was interesting whenever we had our first real experience of Iannone at Phillip Island this year, and we ended up where obviously you've got all the journalists together at the end of the race and chatting to him about it. And I found him to be the most compelling person I've seen in Superbikes for years, because he just had this massive smile all the time. He couldn't close his mouth. He was smiling that much all the way through those first few rounds. Phillip Island, he could have won a race. You know, obviously Phillip Island is one of his better tracks. That's what we saw this year. Is on his good tracks, he was good. On his bad tracks, you didn't really know he was there at times, but he was still happy to be in Superbikes all the way through the season. He obviously likes being in the center of attention. That's why we ended up with all of the saga about where is he going to race next year, and it dragging on all the time. And it ended up just being a really interesting season for me, Iannone. And I'm really excited to see how he does this weekend, because what do VR46 and Ducati have to lose by putting him on the bike? Absolutely nothing. He's the guy that Ducati thought was their future. You know, up until Argentina and the crash with Davi, he was the guy that was going to win championships for them. That changed everything, and it ended up giving, sorry to say this, Neil, it ended up giving Davi his chance to challenge for world championships. And that should have been Iannone. And for VR46, you know, what do you gain if you put Pirro on the bike? Nothing. So this is the move that makes sense, to put someone else onto it. Personally, I'd like to see Bulaga get the last round of the year if we end up where they make a change for Valencia, because I think Bulaga's deserved it for his performances all season. Obviously, he's had his issues with the VR46 Academy over the years as well, but it does look like that's been hashed up. When you speak to Bulaga about it, he said that, you know, he's had Rossi sending him messages through the season offering him congratulations. So I wouldn't be too surprised if maybe for Valencia you end up with a chance for Bulaga to be on the bike, which I think would be, from a Superbike perspective, a little bit more deserved than what we saw from Iannone.
Yeah, I think it's difficult though, because jumping on a bike without any testing, at least Iannone has ridden a MotoGP bike. He's ridden the Michelins, even though the Michelins have changed a lot in the past 5 years. The tires are such a key part of that, and I think it would be incredibly difficult for Bulaga to just jump on a. I think he has more to lose by just jumping on a MotoGP bike from a superbike. Yes, it would be fun, and he 100% deserves it. But Ducati don't have much testing because they don't have the concessions, so they're saving their tyres from Michele Pirro and the rest of the testing. So I think it's much more likely that we'll actually see Pirro on the bike at Valencia. Also, just because it makes sense for Ducati to have him on there, so he can get up to speed, get up to MotoGP speed again, ready for the test on Tuesday.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well, Dave. And I think that for Bulaga, obviously his goal is to try and win a championship in Superbikes and then give yourself the chance to be back on a MotoGP grid. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But Neil, you're in Bangkok at the minute, getting ready to fly out to Malaysia and getting ready for the Sepang Grand Prix. And what are you looking forward to this week?
What am I looking forward to this week? I mean, I'm looking forward to speaking to Iannone.
Apart from curry for breakfast.
Yeah, I've bought little sachets of porridge with me, so I can have those instead of, because I remember the hotel I stay in. Yeah, curry was kind of top of the menu for breakfast, which I love curry, but breakfast I'm not sure I can manage that. I'm obviously intrigued by the championship battle.
Lightweight.
Exactly. Yes, I remember one year being in Sepang with you, Steve, and you were having yogurt and cereal and fried eggs and curry and rice for your breakfast, which was a quite impressive amalgamation of cultures,
trying to fit in with the locals,
traditions,
and I was jet lagged.
Yeah. It was, and
I had no idea what time it was. I had no idea where I was.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was.
If they're there, why wouldn't you?
Yeah,
you don't become at the tower of power like I am, Neil, by avoiding all those carbs.
That's very true. Yeah. So yeah, I guess those things are probably chief among what I'm most excited to see. Friday afternoon for Moto 2 and Moto 3 with both the championships decided, I'm not necessarily that excited for commentary on Friday, but otherwise, yeah, it should be a fun weekend.
Yeah.
The most interesting thing for me is what happens with Pedro Acosta, because for the first time this year, the second time this year, we come to a track where he's already tested, where he doesn't have to learn the way around on a MotoGP bike, even though, we forget how amazing his adaptation has been. He's only a few points behind Brad Binder, but he's fallen off a whole bunch of times this year, where Binder hasn't. So I think it's really going to be interesting to see Acosta come here, race at a track that he knows, that he doesn't have to learn, that he understands. He was pretty decently quick during the test. But I do think it's going to be another Ducati weekend. Bagnaia and Martin finished first and second in the test, and that was really a presage of the way that the season has gone.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, Dave, after the sprint, whenever we were just chatting away in the group chat about the fact that we had 8 Ducatis in the top 8, and you said, you know what, this will probably never happen again for Ducati. And then within a beat, you were there, like, because they're down to 6 bikes next year. And you could easily see a situation in Sepang where they put themselves into position to dominate there as well. The last 2 Sepang Grand Prix they've been able to win. The bike works obviously so well there. But I think that one of the things I'm most interested to see is, like you mentioned Acosta, and testing went well, this, that, and the other. So often we see have the riders made a step from the Sepang test to the end of their rookie season. And I think that Acosta is going to be really interesting to keep an eye on all the way through the weekend, just for that reason, and to see what happens for him. And obviously enough weather conditions as well, Neil. That's always something that Sepang can throw up.
It is indeed. Yep, exactly. I mean, the Sepang showers are kind of notorious. And it's really interesting just to see, or it will be interesting to see what the situation is, what the dynamic is with the 2 championship challengers. I mean, Pecco won there brilliantly in 2022, but that was also a race where Martin was leading before he crashed out. And I think he was maybe on pole position that weekend as well, or certainly he was on the front row and started like a house on fire. And then last year, he did have the rhythm, but I seem to remember everything was kind of dictated by the tire pressures. It was basically like he who got out front early on pretty much was able to stay there, because getting within 50 meters of the bike ahead would suddenly cause your front tire pressure to skyrocket, and therefore make it very difficult to follow. So we had this quite ungainly sight of the top 4 all spread out by a second or thereabouts. So I hope that won't come into play this weekend. And yeah, I mean, Pecco's track record at Sepang is good. Podium there last year, victory there, as I mentioned, in 2022. Has to win, has to take like a lot of risks. So yeah, I feel like some stuff might happen this weekend. That's my hot take for this podcast.
Things will happen. Events will occur. Hold the front page.
Sign up on patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast for such
learn about
important
events.
Insight. As ever, we will have it where we've got Neil on the ground in Sepang, and Dave, yourself, and Adam will be joining him on the Paddock Note Show through the course of the weekend. So sign up as a Paddock Insider on patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast for that. And it basically gives you a 20-minute roundup at the end of each day of a Grand Prix weekend. You can also sign up for a 1-week free trial. So just make sure you select the Paddock Insiders tier, and you'll be able to hear what the shows are like. And then you can decide whether or not you want to continue as a patron. We're going to have a lot of content all the way through the winter. As Neil said, he's got his interview with Agura's crew chief coming up. David's got an interview with Lynn Jarvis that we'll be posting over the course of the next while when Lynn leaves his position as the head of Yamaha's racing department. And we'll be bringing lots of content through the course of the next couple of months. So check out Patreon for that. As ever, if you, for some reason, are watching us on YouTube and like the shiny heads and the coffee mugs covering faces, like and subscribe the videos. We've seen a big uptick in our YouTube channel, and it does make a difference for the podcast, so thanks for that. And as ever, a big thank you to Renthal Street Fly Racing and KTM for supporting the Paddock Pass podcast.